evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the JPAL Southeast Asia webinar, Emerging Challenges for the Post-COVID-19 Era, Addressing Opportunity, Inequality, and Growth. Before we start, I would like to inform you that we provide Indonesian translation for this webinar. To access the interpretation feature, you can click on the interpretation button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. If you would like to turn on the Indonesian interpretation, you can choose the Japanese option. Sign language interpretation is also available on your screen. Sebelum kami mulai, Ibu dan Bapak dapat menggunakan fitur interpretasi bahasa Indonesia dengan menekan tombol interpretation di bagian bawah layar Zoom Anda dan memilih bahasa Japanese. Before we begin, please make sure your Zoom name uses the following format: name, underscore, organization. For example, Rania Putri _ JPAL. There will be a Q&A session from participants to the speakers at the end of the session. The option to ask questions for the Q&A session is always open during the talk show session. Participants can submit their questions via the Q&A box. When submitting a question, please include information about whom the question is addressed to. For example, JPAL Saya - your questions. Due to time constraints, we will only select 3 questions from participants. This event will be recorded for later uploading to our website and social media accounts. Again, we would like to inform you that we provide Indonesian translation for this webinar. To access the interpretation feature, you can click on the interpretation button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. If you would like to turn on the Indonesian translation, you can choose the Japanese option. Sign language interpretation is also available on your screen. Sekali lagi, Ibu dan Bapak dapat menggunakan fitur interpretasi bahasa Indonesia dengan menekan tombol interpretation di bagian bawah layar Zoom Anda dan memilih bahasa Japanese. During the webinar, you may interact with us on Twitter using the hashtag #WebinarJPALSEA. And don't forget to mention us at JPAL_SEA. For any inquiries, please contact Rizka at rfirdaus@povertyactionlab.org. I would like to remind you that the event will start at 16:35 or 4:35 p.m. Jakarta time. Good evening, afternoon, morning, or night, ladies and gentlemen, from wherever you are around the world. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. My name is Rania Putri, and before we start the event, please allow me to guide you through today's webinar. First of all, on behalf of the organizers, I would like to say welcome to JPAL Southeast Asia's webinar, Emerging Challenges for the Post-COVID-19 Era, Addressing Opportunity, Inequality, and Growth. We would like to thank you all for being here with us today. Today's webinar is brought to you by the Abdulatif Jamil Poverty Action Lab, or JPAL Southeast Asia, hosted by the Institute for Economic and Social Research, LPEM FEBUI, at the University of Indonesia, with the support from the Government of Australia. This webinar will provide insights into the Government of Indonesia's policy directions and learnings from global evidence about challenges faced in different sectors, including health, inequality, and environment. The webinar will be a platform to bring together actors who work in the economic and development sectors, as well as the general public, to disseminate and also enrich discussions on solving post-pandemic challenges in Indonesia. For the next hour, we will be discussing Indonesia's policy directions and strategies in facing post-pandemic challenges and share lessons from existing evidence drawn from studies by JPAL-affiliated researchers in the fields of economic, health, and environment. Today's event will be divided into 4 segments. First, before we start, we will hear the opening remarks from Mr. Steve Scott, Australia's Chargé d'Affaires to Indonesia, followed by a short video that will briefly explain the topics covered in the webinar. Afterwards, there will be a talk show session with Ibu Sri Mulyani, the Minister of Finance of the Republic of Indonesia, and Professor Abhijit Banerjee, Ford Foundation International Professor of Economics at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. The discussion will be moderated by Dr. Chatib Basri, Senior Partner of Creco Research. We will have a Q&A session at the end of the talk show before closing the event with closing remarks. I've just had some news because Mr. Scott is not currently here. Our opening remarks will be delivered by Ibu Lina Marliani, the Executive Director of JPAL Southeast Asia. Without further ado, we invite Ibu Lina Marliani to deliver the opening remarks.
So, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Lina Marliani, and it's a pleasure for me to welcome all of you to today's webinars. First of all, I would like to extend a warm welcome to Ibu Sri Mulyani, the Minister of Finance, Republic of Indonesia, who will be joining us today in a discussion with Professor Abhijit Banerjee, the Director of JPAL and a Ford Foundation International Professor in Economics at MIT. A warm welcome also to Dr. Chatib Basri, the co-founder and senior partners of Creco, who will moderating today's session. Ladies and gentlemen, once again, welcome to JPAL SEA webinar on emerging challenges for the post-COVID era, addressing opportunity, inequality, and growth. This webinar presents an extraordinary opportunity for us to listen to the discussion on Indonesia post-pandemic policy direction and also to learn from global evidence on the challenges faced in 3 different sectors: health, inequality, and environment. Since the establishment of JPAL SEA back in 2013, with the support of the Australian government, we have been working to reduce poverty and generate social changes by ensuring that policy is informed by scientific evidence. As we face the looming threat of the COVID-19, we acknowledge the importance of having rigorous evidence, now more than ever, in determining the right policy to mitigate the impact of COVID-19. In many countries, including Indonesia, the COVID-19 pandemic has caused significant economic disruption with an adverse impact on job and livelihoods. Last year, JPAL affiliated researcher conducted an online survey to analyze the social economic impact of COVID-19. Results suggest that as October 2020, out of 5,500 respondents, as many as 63% have lost their job to the pandemic, and only 24% of the households report eating as much as they should in the last week. Although the COVID-19 has undoubtedly affected all of us, the impact of the pandemic is larger among the poor and near poor households who do not have the privilege to keep their jobs nor maintain their cost of living. This condition raised the question of whether or not the pandemic will further the gap in equality in the country, especially during the recovery process. Moreover, the recovery phase also begs the question on health, especially related to ensuring maximum vaccination coverage and the possibility of a green recovery in Indonesia. These 2 points we'll also address in today's webinar. So JPAL SEA has always been in a close collaboration with the Government of Indonesia, sharing evidence from our study that may help to combat COVID-19, induce poverty among millions of people, and we will remain committed to doing so. This reality we are facing highlight the needs of the strategic action to cushion the pandemic's health and economic consequences, protect the vulnerable population, and set the stage for a lasting recovery. Going back to the mission of JPAL SEA to support the generation of evidence-based policy, We hope that today's discussion can provide insight on how better navigate the road to COVID-19 pandemic recovery in Indonesia. Once again, thank you to all our speakers for being here today and the participants who have joined this webinar from all over the world. I hope the result of today's discussion will be valuable for all of us. Thank you.
Ibu Lina Marliani, thank you very much for the warm opening remarks as a start to our webinar. We are deeply grateful for your attendance this evening, and we hope you will enjoy this event. As previously explained, this webinar will provide some insights into the Government of Indonesia's policy directions and learnings from global evidence about challenges faced in different sectors, including health, inequality, and environment. I will soon be handing over the show to Dr. Chatib Basri. But before that, please allow me to introduce our moderator for this evening. Dr. Chatib Basri previously served as the Indonesian Minister of Finance from 2013 to 2014. He was also the chair of the Investment Coordinating Board, an advisor to the Minister of Finance, Ibu Sri Mulyani, from 2006 to 2010, as well as the deputy chair of Komite Ekonomi Nasional. Currently, he is a member of the World Bank Advisory Council on Gender and Development and teaches economics at the University of Indonesia, where he was previously the director of the Institute of Economic and Social Research. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Chatib Basri.
Thank you very much, Rania. Very good afternoon to all participants in Indonesia and very good morning, US. This is a great opportunity for us to discuss about pandemic, and so how are we going to mitigate the situation? As we are speaking today, many developing countries are facing a very situation pandemic. Just want to check whether you can hear me okay. I hope so. As Ibu Lina mentioned in her remarks that this COVID pandemic has caused a significant economic disruption on livelihoods, especially among the most vulnerable segments of the society. And since Ibu is here, I can imagine that the situation is truly there are not good options available, and yet the policymakers, especially the finance minister, is pivotal in leading their countries through this extreme situation. So the most important question is, how do emerging economies, a country like Indonesia, could navigate the situation, and we can learn from the country experience as well. And we are very fortunate that this afternoon we have two very distinguished speakers with us. The first speaker is Indonesia Minister of Finance, Ibu Sri Mulyani Indrawati. I believe that it's about Indonesia's policy direction in navigating the pandemic. And the second is Professor Abhijit Banerjee, professor from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology in economics for 2019. So I do hope that our conversation will be very fruitful, and we can address some of the important issues that need to be discussed later on. So very good afternoon and good morning, Bu Sri Mulyani. Let me start our session by posing a question to both of you. First, on the issue of the improving vaccination coverage. Solving the COVID-19 health crisis is often perceived as the precondition for solving the COVID economic crisis. But unfortunately, the situation is easier to be said than done, because as we can understand that all the countries will put the priorities on providing the vaccine for their own people. Yeah. And then the situation might create a problem like a prisoner's dilemma in the game theory, because every country will, based on the self-interest, will provide the vaccine for their own people. So there is some issue about this, the so-called vaccine nationalism. And unfortunately, this also create an issue about this vaccine inequality. A country who doesn't have an access for vaccine probably will be suffer, especially some countries in Africa and also in Asia. The other issue is also addressing the vaccine hesitancy. And this is not just only a short problem, yeah, a short run problem, but also this problem, may continue in the future. But at the same time, there is some issue that variants of the COVID will continue to emerge. So let me pose my first question to Ibu Sri Mulyani. Yeah, I believe that you've been discussing this issue in the G20. But if you can share with us, how do you see the relationship between the COVID crisis and the economic crisis, i.e., how do those go evolve? And as a global leader, what can a global finance minister like you uh, can do to help the solve of international coordination challenge? So, Minister Sri Mulyani.
Thank you. Thank you, Pak Chatib. Good afternoon for Professor Abhijit. I think this is a very critical time for all countries in the world. First, the pandemic really affecting the economy very significantly because of the nature of this COVID-19 that requiring all of us to have a limitation, to limit the interaction physically. So in order for a country to be able to address or to prevent the transmission, they have to stop, or in this case, halt many of the activity, physical activity or interaction. And that's definitely affecting the economic performance. So your first question regarding how this pandemic, the health crisis, can lead or correlate it with the economic crisis is very strong. There is, of course, a real trade-off between opening the economy versus the ability to control the COVID. The only thing that you can do if you have the vaccine, and the vaccine is only coming after almost 1 year. This is also quite a record fast for the world to invent vaccine. But still, it takes 1 year. And that means the economy is already suffering from on and off. There is the first wave, second wave, and now all countries facing the third wave with the different variant, the Delta variant, the Beta variant, which is becoming even more challenging. Now, the situation is, of course, for a country, the economic is going to be contracted. Recovery is going to be depend on how you are going to address the issue, the necessary condition, that is the COVID first, and how you design your policy in order for you to be able to first protecting the people from this health threat. The safety of the people is very important. And the second, from the economic catastrophic. And the third is to make sure that the financial system is going to be also continue stable. And the third, your macroeconomic policy, the fiscal, is going to be continue sustainable and healthy. So there are so many dimensions at the very moment that you have to deal with this COVID. Now, how the country is now discussing and addressing this issue. First, I think you mentioned about the G20. Pandemic is just like climate change. This is global public bad. And so you cannot address this issue nationally. There is no sovereign country can claim that I can alone solving this issue. And like in a pandemic, there is this not going to be go away, cannot be solved unless all country will have the access of the vaccination. Unfortunately, this is really now the case. First, I think who's inventing the vaccine, how much it costs. how we are going to order this first. I mean, I gave the example like Indonesia. Indonesia is among country who's very fast, very quick. At the very early, we said that we will buy those vaccine. We don't even have those vaccine yet. They are still under the research, but Indonesia has already placed an order. And of course, that will require a huge fiscal cost, but we put all the resources in order for us to secure this vaccine. I don't think that all countries have those kind of luxury as well as the quick decision-making process. That is a problem. Political economic problem, another social, religious problem because of a lot of issues that we are dealing with this vaccine and vaccination. And then the second one is whether you have the resource, that is the fiscal space. Some countries really want to order, but they don't have the fiscal space. They don't have the resources. Globally, we discussed in the G20, there is an initiative to invent and to secure supply of vaccine in order to support, especially for the low income country. Many of them is already in a severe fiscal situation. And that's why under the G20, there is also the discussion about debt restructuring for those countries in order for them to be able to have the access of the vaccine. So a lot of very complicated dimension, Dede, in this case. The third one, even when you secure this vaccine, you have to be able to then deploy it and creating a vaccination program. You can imagine a country as like small like Singapore, they have to really deal with this one very meticulously. So country as big like Indonesia, India, is going to be really, really challenging. Both from the logistical side, because each vaccine, the mRNA is going to be different from the other type of the vaccine. The cold storage, how you are going to decide about the jab and all those things is going to require a totally a nightmare logistical preparation. The third one is, of course, how you are going to persuade people to get vaccinated. Because this is not, I mean, Indonesia, from the very beginning, we actually at that time thinking that for those who have the purchasing power, the middle upper class, they have to pay. And then for those low income, we are going to secure. So we try to calculate. But the president decided that we have to give vaccine for free for all, because it will eliminating all the what you call it constraint or barrier for to get the minimum herd immunity. So that is all a very technical detail, which is not going to be just like saying that, oh, okay, we have money, we buy vaccine, we are going to get this vaccine, and then everybody line up and we are going to vaccinate. That is not the case. Up to now, Indonesia has already vaccinated 41 million, and President want to increase like 2 million per day, which is really a huge task. We're even now deploying the military and the police in order for us to be able to support the civilian doctor in order for us to be able to mobilize this vaccination. And with that kind of mobilization, we were able to achieve more than 1 million in only like a couple of days, because today Indonesia is facing with this, the second wave of especially the Delta variant, which is very dangerous. All countries now are facing with this situation, whether you are talking about Australia, even Singapore, or the ASEAN country, UK, or even Israel, they are all facing with this, the new variant, which is totally another game changer again. So in short, I think at the global level, because this is global public bad, then we have to be able to address this issue of the access of vaccine. Fortunately, President Biden is already announcing 500 million, and then in the G7, they scale up into 1 billion. I think now the discussion about who will get first and how they are going to get not only just rationing or allocating across country, but how they are going to make sure it will be also vaccinated. Don't forget, this vaccine is very fragile merchandise or things. They have an expiration date, which is not that long. So either you're going to like put it there in the country, you have to like do the vaccination, or they are going to be then another wasted. So this is really a very, very challenging task for all countries in the world. But Indonesia will do our part in this case, Dede, in order for us to not only securing for Indonesia, But Minister of Foreign Affairs is also chairing on this the global collaboration for vaccination, for vaccine access vaccine for the especially developing or low income country. I'm in a G20 also supporting all the area, whether this is related to the debt restructuring, as well as a support on this COVAX that is going to be distributed for all countries in the world. So we try to do our part as a member, as well as for the next year Indonesia presidency of the G20. We do hope that we are going to be able not only solving our own problem, but also solving together globally. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister Sri Mulyani. So I was right when I mentioned that this truly situation was a worst nightmare for the policymakers. I would imagine how difficult the situation. So let me now move to Professor Banerjee. Perhaps you can share with us, with the audience, does economics have any lessons or suggestions for how can we think about addressing this issue both on the international cooperation and the challenge within countries of vaccine nationalism, and also the vaccine hesitancy? If you can share with us, Professor Banerjee.
So let me start with the economics of what I think is happening. So one of the concerns that I feel, I feel the finance minister was already articulating is just how to sustain the internal economy of countries like Indonesia, where there was a massive just decoupling of trade. Basically, people were not buying, people were not selling, and as a result, as you remarked and what the video showed, there was a massive increase in unemployment. I think that the worry is in some ways, I think it's a mixed bag. So I would say that one advantage of an economy which is not extremely, highly structured is that a lot of these jobs come and go. In any case, there's high turnover. People do jobs when they find one. Otherwise they don't do it. So in that sense, I feel that it is possible if the economy starts functioning so that the pandemic is in control, then it might well be that the trade relations will resume. And you see in many countries quite a fast recovery whenever the lockdowns are lifted. If I take that as sort of a starting point, that I think there are two issues with that idea that maybe it's just we'll get once the economy is stabilized, so there's no lockdown, maybe things will be okay. I think that's not automatic for two reasons. I think one is that there's a lot of signs that there's a lot of panic among the population. So they have to be assured. Right now, they feel that a lockdown can come at any time. In India, for example, there's been evidence showing that money that the government put into people's bank accounts was not drawn upon. People were doing precautionary savings. They were holding on to the money because they don't know how long it will last. And so unless there is a clear guarantee that whenever there is an economic challenge, they will be supported, people will also be defensive. And what that does is it cuts demand. And so you already have a shock to demand just because people's incomes have gone. And in addition, whoever has money is not spending it because they don't know how long this will last and whether they will lose their jobs next. So you have a massive contractionary force. You saw, in India, for example, there was a 24% reduction one quarter of GDP. That's almost a global record. With a 24%. So you can see that that's partly a result of supply disruption, partly a result of demand disruption. And I think that one of the things that a country like Indonesia needs to think about is how much of the demand can it bring back through fiscal action. And there are obviously fiscal constraints on that. On the other hand, I feel that at least I don't know, the thinking in Indonesia as well, but in India, I feel that the government so far has been extremely conservative there. And I think there's been conservative because the government's worried that if it spends too much, then the bond ratings will suffer, for example. Um, I'm less convinced that that's an issue. I'm less convinced because I feel that, and that sort of was after I've been saying this for a while, and then Standard and Poor's, I think, recently said that no, India should actually spend more because at some level, once you have a mismatch between um, supply and demand, uh, and the whole economy shrinks, then that also creates, if the money supply has not shrunk, that already creates inflationary pressure. So it's not clear to me that letting the economy shrink by not taking fiscal action is a good policy. So I would say that I think there is some reasonable support for that from all the OECD countries, which went very long on fiscal aggression. 20% of GDP spending by was the average in the rich countries, and that's a number. If you compare that with the poorest countries, that number was 2%. And you can see, I think that the fiscal constraints, and I think that we need to be I think more open to the idea of more aggressive fiscal policy than I think we have been, at least in India. I know we are. The second issue, which sort of makes it even harder to think about this and sort of eats the space for it, is that I think we need to start thinking about the banking sector. That a lot of this has led to loans which have not been will not be repaid or cannot be repaid. People just don't have the money to repay. Their small businesses just, or even big businesses, got clobbered by this. And so there is a fiscal challenge from what do you do when the banking sector goes into a shock. And I think some ways that's something we'll see. Actually, we haven't seen full picture of the now, because still, you 3 months you are allowed to roll over the loans, but eventually that's going to start showing up on the balance sheets of the banks. And when it shows up on the balance sheets of the banks, that's going to be lead to further contractionary pressures. Banks will be unable to lend, and we need to start thinking about how to create stabilize the banking sector from now. And I think that's an issue that it has to be sort of wrestled with. So so with these two, I mean, these are both, in some ways I'm saying there are lots of fiscal pressures. The question is, what can the global community do about the fiscal pressures? On the fiscal side, I think, and I'll come back to the vaccine question. On the fiscal side, I feel that the idea that the IMF has floated of sort of issuing a bunch of special drawing rights basically to countries is a good one. I do think that it will create some global liquidity, which I think is going to be, and and how to arrange that so that that money comes to countries that need it and not to the countries that don't need it, that's something that hasn't, I think, been fully sorted out. But it's the kind of conversation that should be going on in the G20, and it's a very, very important piece of that, is that there should be an injection of global liquidity into especially the low income countries. On the vaccine side, I feel that right now we are, I think that the global supply is still very weak. I think that as I think Dr. Basri said, there is a very clear, I think that in terms of restoring the labor markets, which is what I think is going to be first order, what Indonesia can do. There's not many things you can do. The main instrument is still going to be the normal workings of the labor market. And as long as people are not vaccinated, it's not clear how to do that. So it's completely central to the story. I don't think it's incidental to the economics, and it's not a health issue. It's a really, till people just will be scared if there is. So even if you don't, you have only partial lockdowns like Indonesia has had, I think that already people's panic reaction will already create economic disjuncture. So I do think that getting the vaccination rates up is critical. I also think that the rich, and I've written actually quite a bit about this. The rich countries are being completely blind about this, and I know the minister can't say this openly, but I can. I think they're being blind. They're blind because I think every time you do this, it comes back to you. I mean, the fact that in the end, people were not enough people were not vaccinated in India as part of the reason why you get very new variants from India. So it's not a. I mean, there is no choice. There will be new variants as long as we leave the population unvaccinated. There'll be new vaccines. So those will come back to Australia. They'll come back to the UK. They'll come back to France. Now we're seeing the Delta variant in France now. So I think that's a concern that should be globally shared. I think we're being short-sighted. I think the estimate of $50 billion dollars, which would pay for, a very large part of the vaccination, is it's a small change in terms of what the global economy lost in the last year and a half. It's small change, and I think that small change is a small change relative to what Biden is proposing to spend on infrastructure. It's small change. So I think this idea that we have to somehow worry about, be fiscally prudent, maybe only 1 billion doses, not 4 billion doses. We need 8 billion doses, to be honest, to cover the developing world. And I haven't heard anybody saying they're going to pay for 8 billion doses. I think this is extremely blind. It's
Professor,
blind. It's not even in people's self-interest.
Professor Banerjee, sorry to cut you, because I got a reminder from the organizer that session will we only have about 10 to 15 minutes left. So I would like to next question. Professor Banerjee, you mentioned about the issue of this, the impact for the labor market to the poor people. So I would like to pose my next question to Minister Sri Mulyani first. Yeah, understand that a country like Indonesia or some developing countries doesn't have a very good social security system. Yeah, will not be easy to ask for people to do lockdown, because this lockdown is biased in favor towards middle and upper class, unless you do have savings. Yeah, so somehow, exactly like Professor Banerjee mentioned, it depends so much on the fiscal. Yeah, so there is a risk about this possibility of the K-shaped recovery in the future. So my question to Minister Sri Mulyani, from the fiscal side, how do you prepare for this? What kind of fiscal policy that you need to anticipate, to prepare for the possibility or addressing the issue of the K-shaped recovery in the future? Because the fortunate one probably can, survive from this crisis, but probably not for the vulnerable one. Minister Sri Mulyani, if you don't mind, if you can sort of like give your answer in 3 minutes, then I go to Professor Banerjee. Minister Sri Mulyani.
First, I think what just explained by Professor Banerjee, this domino effect of COVID to the economy and even potentially on the financial system, especially banking system, is real, because we are now really dealing, and that's why the design of the policy is not just talking about one specific issue like the COVID itself or social safety net, or you're dealing with the unemployment, but you really have to make this kind of anticipation of this domino effect. So how Indonesia fiscal policy, Professor Banerjee mentioned about you should not be too conservative. I'm glad you said that. For Indonesia, we increased the deficit from originally 2020 1.76% deficit, which is very small, with our debt to GDP ratio 39%. Of GDP. Now we are opening up the fiscal discipline, that is the cap 3% maximum fiscal. We are allowing to exceeding the 3%. We are widened to 6.1%. But the problem is more on execution. So when we design with this fiscal response at that time, of course, we think about what is going to be the first. The first is, of course, health. So at that time, even at that time, when the Minister of Health has no plan yet about how they are going to ask for more budget, we've already tell them, you should not think about financial constraint. Just make the decision what is the best to protect the people, whether this is on testing, tracing, and then as well as on a vaccination. These are all going to be the area that I'm going to provide you with support. The second one, it's a social safety net, as Professor Banerjee mentioned. The problem, like the K-shaped recovery, Dede, in this case, is that the well-off, the middle upper class, which is maybe they are not laying off, they've already plenty or adequate saving, and now they don't have any activity to spend their money. They cannot spend their money. They cannot traveling, they can go to the restaurant. And that's why you see on the banking system, the deposit is keep increasing, especially for the higher saver. But for those, the lower household, that is the area that we really need to provide support. And that's why from the Indonesia, the first response is to expand the social safety net. You mentioned that Indonesia don't have the social safety net system which is secure yet, but at least we have by name, by address, although the data need to be updated after this COVID, because there will be new poor, there is a different of how many that need to be. So we increase the number of recipients of this safety net from bottom 20 to 45% of the population in many different interventions. Food support directly, cash transfer directly. We provide for the small medium enterprises that they are what you call it, have a subsidy on their interest rate. Their principal payment will be delayed for 1 year. So we provide now with the new guarantee for them to be able to borrow new capital for their working capital credit. With the government guarantee in order for them to be able to then roll over. So these are many instruments that we try to intervene. We provide the internet for free for all students and then we provide also additional support in the, what we call it, the job creation, the job card. This is for the new unemployed so that they are going to get cash plus training from the online. So we are inventing so many interventions because this is non-conventional, extraordinary situation. With that, the Indonesia were able to prevent, although we have additional unemployment, 2.5 million, but immediately from September to November, for September last year to December to February this year, we were able to reduce the unemployment by 800,000. So it's going back to 6.26% unemployment rate from 707. The same thing from for the poverty side. If we didn't do all those extra support, the prediction from the World Bank, our poverty is going to increase by 11.8% to 11.8%. But because we were able to do all this extra, even though not perfect, because we are not like really predicting precisely which segment of the people, so there is exclusion, inclusion error, but it's fine. At least we want to provide the whole society. So we were able to prevent the poverty up to the projected by the World Bank 11.8 to only 10.19. So it's at least we avoiding the very catastrophic level of increasing poverty and unemployment. Now the question after second year is how long we are going to be able to stand this one. We were thinking that the first quarter of this year is going to be the recovery. Unlike India, which Professor Banerjee mentioned about the quarter contraction of up to 24%, Indonesia were very fortunate that our deepest contraction is only 5.3%. And that's with the fiscal support of widening deficit from 1.76 to 6.1%. So it's not really big, but very well targeted. So for this,
sorry,
going to like make sure that we will put the lower income additional support, because as you said, the K recovery, that means the support for the bottom 40 will continue needed. But for the upper, we really need to continue providing the confidence that they will be then have a confidence to start consuming again. Because if it is not, then we are not going to be able to recover the economy. So that is more or less what we are doing.
Thank you, Minister. Sorry to interrupt. Professor, let me ask a question to Professor Banerjee then. From the comparative perspective, can we learn something how to address this issue, the possibility of the K-shaped recovery in the future? Professor Banerjee?
To be honest, I don't think we know anything. I mean, I think many countries are facing the same question. I don't think any country has a full answer because we're in the middle of the pandemic. I don't think we can. Let me say something though that I entirely agree with all the instruments that the minister mentioned. I want to mention one other thought, which is I think what the educational impact of this might be quite substantial. That you have the school system has also been shaken up by this pandemic, and and the loss of the usual number estimated actually from Indonesia is that if 1 year of education reduces lifetime earnings by 7%. So those are big numbers. And so I think we really need to think about what to do about it. And I think there I feel that being very open to the idea that you don't go back to the conventional model, that you don't try to just say that, okay, you are now in 8th grade, you missed large part of 7th grade, but you still teach 8th grade, but to go to a sort of facing where the kids are and teaching them what they need to learn. So being much more mindful of the learning gaps is very important. So I do think that when the school system resumes, we need to be very innovative and recognize that there'll be big learning gaps among the most disadvantaged. They are the ones, the families like ours, the children get teaching at home. I can teach my children. Problem is the people who can't. And I think that addressing that very mindfully of the learning gaps and the possibility of long-term loss is going to be critical in dealing with the inequality consequences of this event. Let me stop there.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Banerjee. Now, let me move to our third issue about the change. Yeah, because one thing that we learned from this pandemic, many economic activities has been, declining, will have an impact on the climate change issue as well. At the same time, we know that the interest rate is relatively low. So there is a possibility, or there is a chance for use this crisis for the green recovery. So let me pose the first question to Minister Sri Mulyani. How are you going to take this opportunity, or maybe you can share with us what is Indonesia's plan regarding the green recovery, as I understand that you are one of the co-chairs for the climate finance. Yeah, Minister Sri Mulyani.
Thank you, Professor Basri. First, this is similar like a pandemic. The climate change is going to affect indiscriminately for all countries in the world. So this is purely a global problem. It's not one country problem. That's one. If you're dealing with the global problem, there will be no national or country solution. There should be a global solution. And if we are treating this climate change as the market failure in this case, because the world is not what you call it, pricing the bad pollution like carbon, right? So there will be like a requirement from the methodology point of view that you have to correct this market failure. So that's why creating a carbon market globally is very important. You are dealing with the same commodity that is CO2 pollution, but now when you're talking about carbon market, each country have a different prices, which is doesn't make any sense. So that is going to be like one area that the coalition of finance minister is going to discuss about how we are going to be able to establish a carbon market and establishing the price. Unfortunately, the price of carbon has been like imputed or calculated by expert panel. It's supposed to be $40, but today range from $2 to $3 to $40, and should be, if you are reflecting to the target of reducing CO2 to prevent catastrophic increasing temperature by 1.5 or 2% of centigrade, then the price of carbon should be as high as $120. So that is more, as an economist, we can discuss about all on and on. Now, from the policy point of view, for the developing country like us or emerging country, then you are talking about how you could do. Of course, then first we have to make sure that there is an ecosystem and a system in place. And that's why for Indonesia, after we are participating in the Paris Agreement, we have our national determined commitment to reduce the CO2 by 29% if we are do it our own way, or globally, if there will be a support from the advanced country, it's going to be 41%. Then we are doing it our own part first. That means nationally, we put it on a development plan, national development plan. We set a target. We identify whether this is coming from the forestry, whether this is coming from the energy, whether this is coming from the agriculture. So then we are putting all the reduction in each of the sector that contributed to this CO2 or pollution. The second one is, of course, you mentioned about the environment which is now we are facing is the low interest rate environment, which is, I think, an opportunity. Now with the global liquidity, quite plenty, with the lower interest rate, and there is more a trend of adopting the ESG, that is the environmental, social, and governance principle, putting the climate as an important one. There is a more demand for the instrument like the green bond. And that's why Indonesia is among emerging countries who issue green bond globally. We even combine with the Syariah, that is the Sukuk. So we were able to issue the lowest ever this year, the global green bond. This is not the first time. We've already issued in the last couple of years. So there is what you call the opportunity of financing, but this will not be adequate, as you know, Professor Basri, that this need to have what you call it the global commitment during the Paris Agreement, that they are going to provide 100 billion per year is not yet there. It is not delivered. So it's really kind of like international failure to achieve what is already being agreed. And that's why this is going to be one of the area that we will discuss. Of course, fortunately, again, that the United States now back to the club by actually committing and even now more to be more stronger in committing the climate change problem. So this is going to have a much better opportunity, but still it's going to be quite challenging global environment in terms of especially providing resources for emerging developing country in order for them to be able to achieve their commitment. For each country, I think they really need to strengthen their ecosystem. So establishing the carbon market, providing, we now in Indonesia, we are now initiating the carbon market, we establishing the institutional mechanism, market mechanism, introducing price. We even now submitting the carbon tax within our legislation. So these are all the effort made by us. But at the same time, as well, we recognize globally that will require quite a lot of cooperation that need to translate it into the real result. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. So thank you. Sorry to cut you again because I would like to give room for question to Professor Banerjee. My question is, for many developing countries, the lower middle income, unfortunately, this environmental issue is perceived as a luxury goods because they are more busy to deal with the day-to-day problems like poverty, unemployment. So from the global perspective, how can the lower middle income countries deal with this issue? Any thought about it? Professor Banerjee, I think you are still muted.
So let me start by agreeing with the minister. I do think that this is a global problem and needs a global solution. I think that the pandemic is not going to make it easier for lower and lower income countries, lower and middle income countries to say shift their priorities towards the green issues. I'm very, of course, delighted that Indonesia is doing it, but I think in many countries after the pandemic, there'll be a pressure to, restore the economy, and that's usually not going to be the. I, on the other hand, I feel that part of the consequence of low interest rates is that I think the rich countries need to do what, in some sense, is obviously something they'll eventually need to do, which is to partly pay for the transition that even in poor countries. And I think they have been talking, as the minister said, for some years now, that they were about how much, but in the end, very little happens. At some level, I think that I'm hoping that with COP26, we'll just get a series of much more specific commitments. I think it's really, this talk has been going on forever, but if you look at the Biden administration, what is actually saying about paying for country X to make a transition, there you see much less details. On the other side, I would say countries should be preparing to think of ways in which they can honor the commitment. And it's not easy because all of these things are there's a governance challenge, there's a challenge of figuring out just measurement challenge, who's doing what where. I mean, Indonesia is an enormous country, just knowing where trees are being cut down, it's a challenge. So I do think that there's a sense in which countries need to also be I think, even if the funding is somewhat in this low interest environment, I think it's actually very cheap for rich countries to do it. Whether they do it or not, I don't know. But they should. But countries need to be on the other side honoring the commitment, and then for that we need to build the infrastructure to do it. And carbon markets are a great part of that infrastructure, but also, even with the market, you need to be able to measure whether the commitments are being honored, what's being sold is actually is real. And I think that part of it is, I think, something where we should move fast. I think we should try to create the institutional framework which allows the if there is funding available for it to be used for good. I think that's something where I realize the pandemic is a hard time to do institutional change, but I think we need to start thinking about it.
Thank you, Professor Banerjee. I wish we will have more time to discuss, because we can go on and many issues that need to be discussed. But I'm afraid that if we continue to discuss, then we'll take so much time from Minister Sri Mulyani, but she need to address the main problem of the country rather than discussing it. So let me take a question from the audience, one for each of you. Let me read it for Minister Sri Mulyani. This is from Agna Mahardika. Yeah. Let me read her question to you. I want to highlight one policy, which is a value-added tax act for groceries, education, healthcare. In this pandemic situation where demand is heavily contracted, will this implementation will be even more counterproductive, even if this tax only applied to middle to high income? This is stated. Other measures be implemented, such as chasing income tax for ultra rich, or boost government spending for social assistance for direct cash? I think this is a very topical issue now, Minister Sri Mulyani. And now to Professor Banerjee. This is from Astrid Kartika. Her question is, Professor Banerjee, using data from the pandemic situation and putting aside the need to boost economic growth, have we assessed whether countries can actually be self-sufficient without having to rely on international or regional trades to fulfill the domestic supply needs? Is there anything we could learn on this? Thank you. So let me give an opportunity to Minister Sri Mulyani on this VAT tax, Minister?
Thank you. I think the question is about the reform on a taxation that we just submitted to the parliament and start to be discussed. As we all know, at this very moment, the government focus is to protect people and recover the economy. So that's why we are still running the deficit at 5.7% of GDP this year, last year 6.1%, and this is much higher than the traditionally Indonesia should not allow 3% of GDP. And we are also making sure that the people, whether this is on a health area, get vaccinated to achieve the herd immunity. We are going to provide also support for the poor. As I mentioned, we are expanded up to 40% of the population to receive the social safety net. We provide also for the small, medium enterprises support, and also for the labor intensive program in order for us to be able to create job, especially for the lower skill labor. So these are all our concentration or focus at this very moment, including we are also watching and observing, monitoring the corporation, because we are not also want to see a massive bankruptcy that will be very catastrophic for the economy. So that's why we provide them with the incentive taxation. So for the corporation, we provide taxation, for example, like the income tax for their labor is paid by the government, their import duty has been paid by the government, corporate income tax has been lowered. So these are all the what you call it a breathing space or even support by the government in order to make sure that the corporation, people, and also all the economic stakeholder can survive this COVID. Now, even though we are focusing on this, we should not forget in the medium and long run, Indonesia should and continue have to build their fiscal space. Currently, Indonesia only collecting tax ratio, which is around 8.5 to 9%, among the lowest in the world. And many of the analysis has been done. One is, of course, because we provided a lot of exception. So there is quite a lot of what you call it loophole within the tax rule. The second one is, of course, also collecting effort that need to be increased. The third one is because easily to evade the tax with the global, what you call it, operation of many of the stakeholder or corporation in this case. So at the global level, we are working, whether this is on the G20 with the base erosion profit shifting initiative to prevent those kind of tax avoidance. We are now doing the global agreement to prevent those BEPS, that is base erosion profit shifting. So this is exactly what Atna Mahardika is saying. Why not you chasing the tax for those who are supposed to pay tax? I'm not going to use the word ultra rich. Those people or corporation who are supposed to pay tax, then they have to pay tax. And the room for the avoidance or evasion should be limited. And that is exactly what we are doing. Whether this is through the global cooperation, whether this is through our own internal legislation, for example, like the access of information, and also increasing and investing, for example, the use of the data analytic and so on. We also now expanding, for example, because we are moving more on a digital economy. So we just want to make sure that all corporation in a digital economy is going to pay tax, just similar to the regular corporation. So there will be an equal paying field. Now, another reason of why Indonesia have also lower tax ratio is because of we provided a lot of exception. For example, like in some commodity, including agriculture and then health and education, there is really a, what you call it, non-taxable object, whether this is good or services. And that creating quite a lot of complication on enforcement when you have those kind of exception. So for us, when we are going to put this in the system, it doesn't mean that immediately we are going to tax them. We can provide what you call it the VAT, the multi-tariff VAT. There is a lower tariff for the those who's poor, or even we even can zero them, yeah, providing with the zero tariff up to the level of 10 and 12%. This have a consequence, of course, but this is how we try to provide what you call it equality and fairness. But we want to make sure that all goods and services should be within the system, so not creating a loophole or leakage in this case for the system that can then creating another challenge of enforcement. As of what Adna mentioned, what is the government affirmation to the small, what you call it, petani, what you call it,
farmers,
farmer, as well as health and education? We can use the instrument on the spending side rather than distorting the tax side. So government spending on the education is 20% of our budget. That will cover all the subsidy for the poor, providing scholarship, providing access, providing teacher assistant, and all those things. So that is from the spending side. The same things from the health area. We provide, in this case, the health security or health insurance, access to the health, all is on the spending side. But in order for us to be able to spend enough or adequate, you need to revenue from the tax side. So these are all what I'm actually presented to the parliament this week. What is the design of our taxation reform, which is a comprehensive one, which is going to allow Indonesia to build a better, stronger, sustainable, and fair taxation. All of this measure not immediately tomorrow will be discussed and then tomorrow will be implemented. We are very mindful about this pandemic situation, but we will discuss it. We can maybe implement it according to the speed of the recovery, so that by the time when Indonesia recover, then Indonesia will also recover the fiscal side, the economy, and the health and the welfare of the people. So these are all the strategy that we are now putting in the parliament. And of course, we are going to discuss from all aspects, including what Atna mentioned about the equality, just, or in this case, fairness, and also for our ability to make sure that Indonesia is going to be able to maintain a sustainably on the fiscal side. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Professor Banerjee? You are still muted, Professor Banerjee.
Quickly, because I know you're short of time, I'm just going to, I don't think that one should think of the pandemic. I think the idea that pandemics, the reaction to the pandemic is to isolate, seems to me to be wrong. I think it's a pandemic. The pandemic, if anything, should be seen as a moment for us to appreciate that, you know, we have a shared humanity. And I think the idea, in fact, I would say the real danger here is that the rich countries think they can get away with isolating. I think that's where we face the danger. So I have little sympathy for the idea that the pandemic should be an excuse for isolation. I am not against restrictions on trade for environmental and other reasons. Sometimes there's maybe too much trade, but I don't think that that's the case. I wouldn't use a pandemic as an excuse to shut down trade.
Thank you, Professor Banerjee. I wish, as I said, I wish we had more time to discuss, because there are many issues, and I do believe that, this is a very interesting discussion, but the time is limited. But perhaps one thing that we learn, I don't want to make a conclusion or to summarize our discussion, that this is the reality. We are not living in the first best world, and policymakers, they have to work within constraint, and this is not an easy thing. We probably need to learn something from this process on the policy, on the economic fields, etc. And it reminds me with your book, Professor Banerjee, about this good economics during the hard times. Yeah, good economics for the hard times. Perhaps this book, your book, will be very relevant for the future. So with that note, I would like to thank you, Minister Sri Mulyani, and Professor Banerjee for your
Thank you.
excellent discussion and conversation. And I do believe that our discussion will be very fruitful. So I, over this session to the. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much to Dr. Chatib Basri for moderating the session, and to our distinguished panelists, of course, Ibu Sri Mulyani and Professor Abhijit Banerjee, for your time and insightful perspectives on the topic at hand. With this, we hope the conversations that took place were thought-provoking and insightful for everyone in attendance this evening. We are nearing the end of the event, and now I would like to invite Mr. Steve Scott, Australia's Chargé d'Affaires to Indonesia, to take the stage and deliver the closing remarks. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Steve Scott. Mr. Steve Scott, I think you're still muted. Yeah.
Okay, sorry. Look, my apologies for not being available earlier, but I did manage to listen to most of the presentations, and it was really thought-provoking. I would like to say that thanks to Ibu Sri Mulyani, to Professor Abhijit Banerjee, also to Bapak Chatib Basri for participating in this event so generously, and also to Ibu Lina Mulyani from JPAL, our really important partners. And what I will say is, what this event highlighted is just how important some of the work is that we're supporting through organisations like JPAL to provide really timely evidence and advice to governments where they have very limited resources. They need to make the right decisions for their people in a very uncertain and rapidly changing time. So I think the work that these partnerships through JPAL and others are doing is really timely. We're pleased to be supporting that. And just finally, also with our whole development cooperation program with Indonesia, we've pivoted and adjusted most of our major investments to support areas through education, social protection, helping the most vulnerable, who we know are suffering the greatest impacts from the COVID-19 pandemic. And we'll continue to do so to support a rapid recovery from Indonesia and all the countries in the region, because we are all in this together, and we need to all find a way out of it together. So again, thank you very much, everyone, for today's events.
Thank you to Mr. Steve Scott for your closing remarks. As we have finally come to the end of this event, I would like to thank once again Mr. Steve Scott for delivering the closing remarks, Ibu Lina Mulyani for delivering the opening remarks, Dr. Chatib Basri for moderating today's event, and of course to our distinguished panelists, Ibu Sri Mulyani and Professor Abhijit Banerjee for the discussions. We would also like to express our deepest gratitude to all the participants for your attendance and enthusiasm. Before we end the meeting, we would greatly appreciate it if you could give us your feedback on today's event. You may access the link to the survey feedback form once you leave the Zoom meeting. Due to time limitations, we would also like to express our regret as we could only select a few questions from the participants. If you want to know more about JPAL SEA, you may visit our website at www.povertyactionlab.org/SEA. Today's webinar was recorded and will be later uploaded to our official social media accounts. Thank you once again for your participation and attention. We would like to apologize for any inconvenience that might have occurred during the webinar. I am hoping that we can meet again on another occasion. I am Rania Putri, and it has been an absolute pleasure to host this event tonight. Thank you and have a good rest of your day.